Hi friends, today we're talking about a tough subject, death. More precisely, what happens after it. And no, I don't mean the afterlife. I mean the funeral industry, how it works in Russia, where many funeral companies still feed off people's grief. Funeral services are considered a profitable business. After all, people die every day. But in Russia, this industry is barely regulated. In 2021, the funeral law was updated, but it didn't make things any less chaotic. Scandals keep popping up. Every so often you hear another story from the regions about some funeral firm pulling off absolute nonsense, agents calling families the moment someone dies. Total confusion at cemeteries. Morgues refusing to release bodies. And why morgues? Because the funeral business is often tangled up with crime and corruption. Doctors, local police, morgue staff, cemetery workers, all of them can end up involved in shady schemes. Overall, it's a huge, messy, and honestly pretty unpleasant topic. In 2022, the industry was rocked by a major scandal. The outlet Zynak.com published a big investigation into corruption and abuse in the funeral market in Kuban. One company there had basically seized the entire market, backed by law enforcement officials and morgue employees. And to force grieving families into their services, they'd do just about anything. Bodies were held for up to 2 weeks, kept outside of proper storage, sometimes even deliberately damaged if the family chose a different funeral service.
People were being traumatized on purpose.
Sergei Dryling, owner of a small private funeral firm in Novorossiysk, a port city in Krasnodar Krai. For years, he's been fighting the municipal funeral service. He files complaints with the authorities and the media.
If you go to another company, you'll face delays at the morgue, your documents will be held up, and the body will be released in terrible condition.
Most of the abuse in Novorossiysk's morgues happens to Dryling's clients. His funeral agency is small and works in districts far from the center. People there know him, so they tend to trust him. His main competitor is Ritual Center, run by city officials who have administrative power. That gives them monopoly control over the key parts of the funeral industry: morgues and cemeteries.
You want me to start right away? I've only got a stick. Am I supposed to work with a stick?
They're monopolists. We have this company, Ritual Center. They're the only ones allowed to do burials here. A standard grave costs about $105, but if someone wants a plot in a closed cemetery, it starts at $620 and goes up with no real limit. They're the only ones allowed to dig graves. No one else gets permission. For 3 years straight, I've been filing complaints to the prosecutor's office, the investigative committee, the financial crimes unit, the police, the regional prosecutor, the Krasnodar investigative committee, everywhere. But I get no real answers, just empty replies. They pretend nothing's wrong. I'm convinced law enforcement itself is breaking the law.
In Krasnodar region, in the fall of 2022, a funeral agent from Timoshevsk brought a woman's body, wrapped in a sheet, right to the steps of the city administration.
I've been trying for 3 days. I can't get my own mother accepted.
The morgues refused to take her, unless he paid for a service that's supposed to be free. His colleagues backed him up and said they'd bring even more bodies if nothing changed.
We'll all gather together and we'll bring everybody here to the administration.
The result? They opened a case against him for abusing a corpse. If you think this is just some local madness, it's not. Stories like this happen all over the country. In 2015 in Yekaterinburg, access to the forensics building was blocked and only one company's hearses were allowed through. The rest practically had to toss bodies over the fence. And in 2016, during another turf war in the funeral market, there was an actual shootout at Kovanskoye Cemetery in Moscow.
In the 21st century, the head of a forensics bureau and the health ministry are literally selling bodies out of a morgue. When someone dies, the body becomes a commodity.
So how is any of this even possible today? Let's look at how the industry is regulated and who's supposed to oversee a person's final journey. The main burial law was passed back in 1996. It still contains things like rules for post-mortem execution. Even though Russia has a moratorium on that punishment, there's even a separate clause about burying terrorists. But the law never defines what a funeral service actually is, or what it should include, and overall, legislators handed control of cemeteries and the funeral sphere to local authorities, meaning every city basically sets its own rule. Even state-standard coffin manufacturing only appeared 7 years ago. The latest amendments were adopted in 2021. The biggest change. Now self-employed individuals can legally enter the funeral business. To understand whether that's good or bad, and what these amendments might mean, I talked to one of Russia's leading experts on death, Sergei Mokov.
The federal law itself is just a huge framework, and the amendments they've been adding for the past 20 years don't really change anything.
Sergei Mokov, Russian social anthropologist, PhD in sociology, author of several books on the funeral industry, and since 2021 a research fellow at Liverpool John Moores University.
All these amendments are basically just broad, vague principles. The market is poorly regulated by rules no one understands and that constantly changes. And a huge share of services in this field are provided with no legal status at all. None of it has ever made a real difference. So yes, letting self-employed people enter the market might make some things easier. But the real problem is the lack of proper competition. There just isn't a competitive landscape. The core issue is that we don't have private infrastructure, things like private cemeteries or private crematoriums. If undertakers could build and run that infrastructure, they could actually compete. Right now, they're just middlemen stuck in a long, uneven funeral chain. Most people think it's all greedy capitalists trying to cash in on grief, and that only the state can clean this up with its iron fist. When something unfair happens, people demand the government step in and regulate everything. But you're saying that to actually fix the industry, we need more private investment, not less, and that the state needs to step back so real competition can exist. You have to understand, in today's Russia, funerals are already almost entirely a state-controlled sphere. So when officials start talking about new measures and blaming private business, let's be honest, the morgues where people get charged are state institutions. The cemeteries charging illegal fees are state-owned too. The cemeteries charging illegal fees are state-owned too.
Really, anyone can get into this business. All you need is a mobile phone and ideally some connections. For example, a friend on duty at the police station who gets the death call rings you up and says, "Go convince the family to sign contract with you."
Ivan Golunov is an investigative journalist. He's worked for outlets like Vedomosti, Forbes Russia, RBC, and others. In 2018, he published a major investigation into Moscow's funeral industry. While working on that story, he was arrested on drug charges. After huge public outcry and protests, Ivan was released. A good funeral agent is the one who can shut everyone else out of the system. Maybe they've got an exclusive line to a police department that leaks every death report, so they reach the family first. Or they have relatives in the morgue who refuse to accept or release bodies for other funeral homes. They'll say, "You can only work with this company, those are the rules." Or maybe it's some official, a deputy head of housing services, for example, who can block access to the cemetery. In other regions, the business is run directly by law enforcement, usually police officers who also have access to death data and can easily arrange things with local officials and morgues. It creates the feeling of a black market run by shady figures, former police chiefs or people like that. And sure, that exists. But in reality, it's a normal business that simply lacks clear rules, proper oversight, and a fair control system.
Do you still think you can only use VPN in Russia or China? Not really. VPNs can come in handy anywhere. Say when you want to safely use free Wi-Fi at a cafe or airport, a VPN encrypts your data so that no one can intercept it. Or maybe you want to watch your favorite Netflix show that's only available in the US. A VPN changes your virtual location so you can access it. And don't forget about work. Many companies require VPN access for internal systems connection. In general, wherever you are, a VPN is about safety, comfort, and freedom. To browse the internet without restrictions or unnecessary stress, try VPN Liberty. It's incredibly easy to use. All you need is add your key and connect. The VPN runs smoothly, even with torrents, no limits there. And if anything's unclear, support is available 24/7. VPN Liberty operates through 400 servers and has been successfully bypassing censorship for a year and a half. Even in countries with strict internet control like Iran, Turkmenistan, China, and regions of the North Caucasus. Lately, the service has grown from 0 to 68,000 users, all without sponsors. And as always, I've got the best deal for my dear viewers. The first 30 days are free. Just follow the link in the description, activate the bot, and enjoy a free and secure internet experience. I went to Ivan Golunov for a reason. In 2019, two of his investigations on this topic made national headlines. He uncovered corruption schemes involving businessmen, officials, and law enforcement. At the time, everything around Ivan was loud and tense, because right before publication, police planted drugs on him and arrested him. Media outlets and ordinary people rallied to defend him. Protests were held in cities across the country. The case was obviously fabricated. Ivan was freed and the officers involved were the ones put on trial. And his funeral industry investigation ended up getting attention across Russia, though Ivan himself doesn't believe it was the cause of his arrest.
I see people getting smarter, officials getting smarter. You expose one scheme, and a year later, there's a new one with new names. You dig into it, and it all leads to the same place.
According to Ivan, the outright criminal chaos of the 90s, the gangs and organized crime groups, is mostly gone from the funeral business. Moscow and the regions now have their own established markets. There are small private agents without offices, but with connections. But in most places, the industry is dominated by one or two major companies.
Open it up. You've no right to detain us. You're representatives of the authorities.
These companies are often run by people from law enforcement or by local officials. In Volgograd, for example, a major funeral firm belongs to a municipal deputy.
There's a total monopoly on funeral services there. The company is called Memory. And things are already so tangled now. Originally, it belonged to Irina Solovyova, a deputy of the Volgograd Regional Duma. Her husband ran the local funeral enterprise for decades back in the Soviet years. Then that enterprise suddenly went bankrupt, and a private company appeared in its place. And this private firm has its own call center, where all law enforcement and healthcare workers are required to report every death. The first thing they do is call the call center and say, "We've got a death. Come out."
The entire process, from the moment a person dies to the moment they're buried, is actually straightforward. If the death isn't violent, the family calls an ambulance and the police. The medics confirm the death. The local officer writes a report that there was no crime. Then a specialized service transports the body to the morgue. The next day, the relatives can get the death certificate there. A funeral service or ritual company takes the deceased to the cemetery. The burial itself, digging and filling the grave, is usually done by cemetery workers. And that's it. But in cities where companies are fighting hard for customers and market control, families can run into problems at any of these steps, especially if they've chosen the wrong funeral agent.
When those agents came to pick up the body, they didn't give us a receipt. They just said, "Pay $45. We handed them 50. No receipt, no change, nothing. They gave us the number for Anna at the Novorossiysk morgue and told us not to contact anyone else. They refused to release the body. They said, "Oh, you're with Sergei, then you won't be buying anything from us. You're at the end of the queue, we've got plenty of people." And they kept delaying and delaying. We finally got him back on the 11th day. He was in terrible condition, mouth open, eyes open.
Very often, right after you call an ambulance, you'll get a call from a funeral service, sometimes several. The company that learns about the death first gets a competitive edge. To stay close to the flow of bodies, some even open offices directly inside morgue buildings. Mostly, though, they rely on contacts in the ambulance service and the police. All this information is supposed to be protected as medical confidentiality, but realistically, the worst that can happen to a medic who leaks it is a reprimand and a fine.
They show up and immediately start offering services because the main objective is to take control of the body, to secure a kind of monopoly over it. That's where the first battle begins. This is where the so-called data leaks happen. In most countries, this is something regulated very strictly by law, even with criminal liability. In Russia, it's just an administrative offense.
Do you know how much it costs to sell this data?
It depends on the region. In Moscow, I'd say around $250.
Someone gets a call. This old man didn't wake up, and that person can make $250 just by calling the number on the little business card an undertaker once handed them.
Yes, but again, it's hard to describe this as some structured, taxi-like service with fixed rules. Roughly $250 in Moscow, 60 to 120 in the regions. But usually it's all a pre-arranged setup, and there's no KPI here. It doesn't matter whether they end up getting the body or not. 5 undertakers can show up, but only one walks away with the body. Usually, specific people leak information to specific funeral agents. It's an established system.
A police officer would send text messages to several funeral agents at once, and suddenly 3 agents would run to the same grieving family. Whoever got there first got the order. More precisely, whoever got there first and grabbed the passport. The passport of the deceased is the key object. And if a black market funeral agent sees he has competition, his first mission is to sprint over and seize the passport.
In the old days, the funeral sphere had terms like Project 02 and Project 03.
Oleg Shelyagov, entrepreneur, owner of the Ritual.ru holding, and co-owner of Ritual Service. In Moscow, he's known as the country's main undertaker. He has been featured in several journalistic corruption investigations.
One group cuts deals with crooked law enforcement officers, another with ambulance staff. That's how they make their money. But I think the problem isn't in those individual people who adapt to the system. The problem is the system itself.
We even had a case where death information was being sold by a hospital cleaner, not a nurse, a cleaner working in the medical ward.
Ilya Boltunov, owner and founder of the Zhuravli funeral service chain. He sells franchises across the country. His company also offers pre-need funeral contracts when a person plans and arranges their own funeral in advance.
Yes, she was just cleaning the wards, and if she noticed someone had died and later met the relatives who came to the hospital, she would quietly approach them and hand them a business card from a particular funeral agency.
In Moscow, city officials have tried to bring some order to the system and cut black market agents off from ambulance and police data. The task of body evacuation in the city was handed over to the state enterprise Ritual.
I've been watching chat groups where funeral agents talk. Everyone's complaining that there are almost no orders. Someone says, I only had one order in 10 days. Last year, that same person had 7. And that's just from tightening one channel. E-ambulance service. Data is still leaking from all sorts of other places, but we're seeing the effect. Once people lose access to the information, black market funeral agents immediately start whining. How could this be? Why is Ritual now handling body transport? And yes, when a representative of a state funeral service shows up, families often feel like they must sign a contract with them. But that's not true. If someone has their own funeral agent, which is rare but it happens, they have every right to choose. This actually pushes the market toward real competition. Suddenly your job isn't finding a cop who leaks you death data. Your job becomes marketing, telling people who you are, why you're better than Ritual, promoting your services openly.
The problem is that Ritual is itself one of the major players in the Moscow funeral market. Its main competitor is Ritual Service. Both companies were featured in Ivan Golunov's 2019 investigation. And in 2020, Ritual Service was raided by police.
Law enforcement officers have the right to inspect anything they want. They came, carried out their inspection, and it seemed like they were expecting to walk into some old-style funeral agency. You know, piles of cash over here, severed limbs over there, all sorts of horrors. It felt to us like they were somewhat biased.
Oleg Shelyagov believes there should be no state or municipal companies in the funeral industry. He says these institutions always have more resources, and that destroys competition in the market.
They do huge amounts of work maintaining cemeteries, allocating burial plots. And that is their job, and they should be doing it. But when they start manipulating these responsibilities and persuading the city authorities to put state agents into every morgue in the city, all through these strange legal mechanisms they consider legitimate, the community can't help but be surprised. The government needs to decide either these are fully state-run services, and then we shouldn't use the word market. But if we're calling it a market, then no one should get special treatment. We hear a huge number of complaints about the funeral sphere. But if you break them down, the overwhelming majority relate to processes controlled by the state. Morgues, the Ministry of Health. Relatives are often victims of illegal extortion. The same goes for cemeteries. Not every employee or municipal worker behaves appropriately. Sometimes they sell services or items they're not supposed to, and unfortunately, this also applies to those Project 02 and Project 03 employees, police and ambulance workers who sell information.
Most scandals happen in morgues. Sometimes they refuse to accept bodies. Other times they refuse to release them. Or, as happened in the Krasnodar region, bodies get outright mutilated. Relatives may be denied a death certificate or pressured into buying unnecessary services. In February 2022, for example, pathologists at the morgue in Nakotka were caught extorting money from families in exchange for speeding up autopsies. Morgues are part of the healthcare system and come in 3 types: pathology departments in hospitals, forensic examination bureaus, and remains storage facilities. Where the body goes depends on how the person died. By law, morgues must store a body for 7 days free of charge. In some cases, this can be extended to 2 weeks. They must also wash, dress, and place the body in a coffin. Extras like makeup cost extra. A death certificate must be issued within 24 hours. After determining the cause of death, the body must be released upon request no later than 48 hours afterward. Since anyone can handle funeral arrangements, not only family, documents proving kinship are usually not required. Typically, they ask for your passport, the deceased's passport. In practice, these formalities are often ignored. And the death certificate they never forget to ask for is the receipt proving payment. For morgue services and the funeral company, and if people in the morgue are connected to a particular particular funeral company, customers of other companies can run into serious problems.
When people arrive at the morgue, after the forensic service has delivered the body there, they walk in and immediately see security guards and Cossacks standing at the entrance. The Cossacks send them straight to someone named Ms. Fremchikova to pay for washing and dressing the body. Ms. Fremchikova is affiliated with the head of the forensic service, which means if you don't go through her, the morgue suddenly starts creating delays and obstacles. But if you pay everything they ask, they take $130 for washing and dressing, you hand over the clothing and it all goes to the morgue attendants. Even though these tasks are their legal obligation, washing, dressing and placing the body in a coffin is meant to be free.
Of course, the morgue will accept the body because, as I said earlier, the whole goal is to take control of it. When they have the body, they can dictate terms and extort money. So everyone tries to seize it as fast as possible and only then start negotiating. In reality, morgues operate very differently from one another. Some earn money solely from cosmetic add-on services, and they don't care which funeral company you've chosen. They'll get their money anyway, either through the funeral company or directly from the family. It varies. Then there are the crafty morgue workers, usually in the regions, who have their own funeral directors. Sometimes just one exclusive company that controls everything. Naturally, they're furious if they discover you're only storing the body temporarily and won't be buying anything else from them. It's all very inconsistent, but morgues are one of the main points where these kinds of sales and kickbacks happen. Most of these morgues don't even have functioning refrigeration units at all. Not as a technical feature, not even in theory. Bodies just lie on the floor. During holidays like New Year's, they pile up in separate rooms, one on top of another. Everything leaks, rots, crawls, you name it. In short, Russian morgues are a very grim story, a place everyone should avoid if possible, both the living and the dead.
Is there any law regulating the condition in which a body must be stored? And is there any way to hold a morgue accountable? If they return a body that's been kept improperly?
No, nothing regulates it, and there's no mechanism for accountability. The astonishing thing is that the Russian legal system in this area is full of glaring gaps. Questions like, in what condition was the body stored? Or, who's responsible for its state? Are simply pushed aside. My favorite example, Russia doesn't even have a basic system for tracking the release of bodies, who they're released to, or what happens to them afterward. A morgue is supposed to release a body to the relatives or to the person responsible for the burial. But who exactly counts as such a person? Who's supposed to verify their relationship to the deceased? Who oversees this process? There is no such procedure at all, so bodies are simply handed over to whoever shows a passport.
Once the body has finally been released from the morgue, it's taken either to a cemetery or a crematorium. By law, space for storing the body or for keeping an urn is supposed to be provided free of charge, but families still have to pay the cemetery administration for grave digging. The cost depends on the region, the prestige of the cemetery, and even the season. In winter, for example, burials are more expensive. On average, the service costs around $120. Legally, close relatives can be buried in existing family plots if there's enough room. But if you want to guarantee that someone will rest beside their loved ones, the space usually has to be purchased. In Moscow, there's even a special auction system for establishing family burial sites. The most expensive cemeteries in the capital, Borisovskoye and Troyekurovskoye, start at $50,000 for a 3.6 square meter plot. Closed cemeteries sometimes also have what's called reserve territory, abandoned graves without without monuments, plaques, or any identifying signs. If no responsible party can be found, a commission can declare the grave ownerless. And under sanitary rules, if 15 years have passed since the previous burial, the plot can be reused. If a funeral service manages to strike a deal with the cemetery administration, such plots can become profitable for both sides, unofficially of course. The price depends on the cemetery's prestige and the negotiating skills of the funeral agent.
Legally, there's no clear mechanism describing what kind of plot should be provided. It's all at the discretion of the caretakers, the cemetery administration. At many cemeteries outside Moscow, Butovskoye for example, you drive in and see endless fields. Somewhere in that long line of fresh graves, they'll give you a free spot. No one promises there'll be a water source nearby, or it won't be covered in stones or full of other problems. That's the free option. And this becomes one of the main ways to extract extra money from grieving families. If you want a decent spot, not on the outskirts, not with meltwater up to your knees, you'll have to pay.
So can you buy a plot if you have the money at any Moscow cemetery?
I think yes. It's really just a matter of how much money you're willing to spend.
Even the most famous ones?
Officially, no. Some cemeteries are closed and burial is allowed only in certain areas, usually for cremated remains. But if you have the money, serious money, you can be buried wherever and however you want. It's not a problem at all.
What kind of sums are we talking about?
Well, in the central cemeteries, it easily goes above $25,000.
Russia had long faced a shortage of cemetery space, but during the coronavirus pandemic, the situation became truly cramped underground. According to regulations, no more than 4,000 people can be buried per 10,000 square meters. And in 2021 alone, 2.4 million people died in the country. To bury all of them, you would need around 6 million square kilometers. Even if we roughly assume that half were laid to rest in family plots or cremated, that still leaves a need for 3 million square kilometers of additional land. With such scarcity, it becomes easy for funeral directors to sell a good cemetery plot as a premium service. No one asks where these plots actually come from. Grieving families usually don't have the time or emotional capacity to wonder until supervisory authorities suddenly take an interest in the newly dug graves. In 2011, for instance, the Environmental Prosecutor's Office discovered that Moscow's Butovo Cemetery had illegally seized 3 hectares of forest where 4,000 graves had already been placed. In 2019, over 100 illegal burials were found at a closed cemetery in Tolyari. In 2020, residents in a village in the Omsk region complained that local cemeteries had long spilled beyond their boundaries and were still expanding. Such examples number in the dozens, if not hundreds, and no one really knows how many cemeteries exist in Russia. There is no unified registry. Only in 2021 did authorities finally decide to conduct an inventory and literally count the graves. A centralized database is promised by 2026. Meanwhile, a 2017 study by the Kamovniki Foundation suggested that up to 90% of cemeteries in Russia may be illegal. Creating a new necropolis requires meeting a whole list of sanitary regulations, conducting geological surveys, selecting land far from residential areas and water bodies, ensuring that the soil doesn't flood, and so on, which is why it's often easier to fill a plot with bodies first and then try to legalize it afterward.
You look at the cadastral map and see farmland, fields meant for tomatoes. Then you drive out there and discover several cemeteries and burial sites. This goes back to Soviet times, when there was no oversight at all. And cemeteries sprang up wherever people felt like placing them. In today's Russia, this chaos is still flourishing. And one of the main reasons is simple. If a cemetery is official on the map with a legal status, then the municipality has to spend money to maintain it. It has to meet certain standards, and prosecutors will regularly inspect it, handing out orders and violations that must be fixed. But if the cemetery doesn't exist, then officially there's no problem. So municipalities have no motivation to formalize anything, and cemeteries grow spontaneously. There's even a reverse practice. First, an illegal cemetery appears in a field. People are buried there for 5 to 7 years. Once the field is full, the authorities call the prosecutor's office and say, well, this mess is already here, full of bodies. We can't dig them up now. I would estimate that around 75% of Russian cemeteries exist in this kind of illegal state.
There's no money in the municipal budget, or only token sums are allocated for things like clearing trash and basic upkeep. So someone familiar inevitably appears. At best, it's a small private entrepreneur. There's no official contract, just an informal understanding. You handle the trash at the cemetery, or at least make sure no one complains about it. In exchange, you get access. You can dig graves for whatever price you want and sell plots of land that, in theory, are supposed to be free. Guaranteed free, in fact, by federal law.
Many people may not realize this, but you are not required to use private funeral companies for a burial. The law outlines a list of services the state must provide free of charge. These include preparing all necessary documents, transporting the coffin, delivering the body to the cemetery or crematorium, and the burial itself. For every deceased person, municipal services, so receive compensation from the pension fund. Each city sets its own rates. In Yekaterinburg, one deceased person costs the state $95. In scandal-ridden Krasnodar, it's $80. And in Moscow, where everything is more expensive, municipal services receive $240 for a single funeral. At the same time, both municipal services and private funeral firms are allowed to offer these very same services for money. They can also sign a contract for a so-called turnkey funeral without specifying what exactly is included. Later, it turns out you need to pay extra. For transportation, for example, the cheapest funeral package from a private firm starts at around $500. Often the death of a loved one catches families completely unprepared. Grief-stricken people don't study legal pricing or demand official rate sheets at morgues and cemeteries. Funeral directors exploit this. They emphasize the importance of giving the deceased a proper goodbye, push emotional buttons, inflate prices, and aggressively upsell add-ons.
So you didn't love the deceased enough to bury them in anything better than a simple wooden box? One that might collapse before it even reaches the grave? Is that what you want? That's how the emotional pressure starts. When someone close to you has just died, of course it works. You think, how can I bury them in an ordinary pine coffin? We need an oak one, with a double lid. In big cities like Moscow or St. Petersburg, everyone tries to sell you something, insisting it's impossible without it. What? The deceased will lie in the coffin without a pillow? That doesn't happen. A pillow is essential. And so on. For example, these days, the state-run Ritual very insistently recommends hiring their movers.
According to estimates from the Moscow Department of Trade and Services, the city's funeral market is worth $180 million a year. Yet, according to official financial reports, over the last 3 years, state-owned Ritual earned only around $35 million annually from paid services. At the same time, experts and industry insiders estimated that the shadow segment of the Moscow funeral business amounts to $175 million every year.
A funeral agent earns as much as he can. Basically, as much as he can overcharge while still getting the client to agree. If a wealthy person walks in, someone unfamiliar with prices, someone devastated and crying, something that costs $750 can easily be sold to them for $37.50. When an agent visits the home of the deceased's relatives, the first thing he does is look around. He assesses how well off the family is, and then he names the price accordingly. If you go and ask for a price list, asking for the official rates in many companies, even state-owned ones where such documents are legally required, that price list is treated like a classified file.
A wave of funeral companies appeared in Russia after 2004, when mandatory licensing was abolished. If a company doesn't produce coffins, wreaths, gravestones, and similar items, it doesn't even need an office. Agents travel to clients themselves, hearses can be rented. In other words, the overhead is minimal and the profits are steady and very high. The challenge is simply standing out in a crowded field. And to do that, funeral businesses often resort to the most absurd and shameless methods. Veterans receive postcards advertising funeral services for Victory Day. In Moscow, one company launched an ad campaign featuring half-naked women posing inside coffins. In Omsk, a firm encouraged clients to write letters to deceased relatives. Before New Year's, letters answered by a character they called Dead Santa. Later, the same company even offered to fire cremation ashes into the sky as fireworks. But one of the biggest competitive advantages in this business is access to information about deaths. If you type "how to open a funeral service" into a search engine, you'll find a remarkable guide. In the section titled "Where to find clients," the advice is spelled out plainly. Partner with those who can help you find clients. Morgue employees, doctors, police officers, civil servants.
If you have someone in the district administration, you can make an arrangement. Let me maintain the cemetery, clean it, remove the trash, and in return, I'll be able to sell the plots. So the people who succeed here are those with resources, with access to the funeral infrastructure, those who can receive calls quickly, have contacts in the morgue, or know the cemetery manager. In other words, you need connections.
Every region has its own clearly defined circle of players involved in the funeral business, and the configuration of those players varies drastically from place to place. That's why it's simply wrong to talk about a single, unified, nationwide Russian funeral market. My favorite argument for this: there is no federal funeral company in Russia. In the US, for example, there's Service Corporation International, which operates across all states. Russia has nothing like that. No company works in more than a handful of regions. Typically, if you go to the Kaluga region, you'll find around 15 funeral firms. Then you drive to neighboring Tula, and there are only 3. A completely different landscape, because there, the market is monopolized.
This is the standard business model. Entrepreneurs somehow find a way to buy information about deaths. Then they impose their services, carry them out, and so on. But you can't call this a normal, legitimate business. And if entrepreneurs try to enter the market by using this accepted model, the difficulties are enormous. Practically immediately, you face opposition straight out of the 1990s. The market is established, closed, and very hard to break into. And opposition in this sense means arson, shootings, things like that.
It is possible to get into this business, but the problem is I don't have connections in the administration, the police, or the morgues. I work in villages, in the suburbs. I've lived here a long time, so people know me. Word of mouth works, people know what I do, and they recommend me. So technically, you can get in, but the problem is they don't let you work. Everything around here is corrupt.
Due to the lack of proper legislation and state oversight, the funeral industry develops according to its own rules. These rules can vary from city to city. Some places have already learned to operate according to the principles of a civilized market. Others are still living in the 1990s.
The most extreme example is Kozelsk in the Kaluga region, because there they resisted in every possible way. They ignored the morgue's duties. They refused to release the deceased. They damaged bodies. The prosecutor's office did nothing because, as we know, it's a small town with deeply rooted nepotism. It's very entrenched. Everyone covers for everyone else. Law enforcement protects the business. The administration protects the business. Essentially, they all protect one another. They set fire to funeral pavilions. They attacked employees with pistols. They started fights. Everything that's illegal must have happened there. And the administration created obstacles too. A business can function like a business, that's fine. But you have to want to do the work. You have to actually work. You need real entrepreneurs to come there. Young people, perhaps. Or maybe not young, but definitely not, the degenerates from the 1990s. Or maybe they weren't literally from the 90s, but they still work and think in that 90s style. But look, everything has changed long ago.
During the pandemic and amid a shortage of cemetery space, demand for cremation services grew, and afterward entrepreneurs began increasingly exploring the possibility of opening private crematoria. Cremation is considered a more environmentally friendly and cheaper method of burial than in-ground burial. But according to a Moscow Funeral Services directory, only 15% of bodies in Russia are cremated rather than buried. For comparison, in Japan, 100% of the deceased are cremated. In France, the figure is 35%. One reason cremation is not popular in Russia is tradition and religion. The Orthodox Church does not encourage cremation, and Islam forbids it entirely. Interestingly, in the early years of Soviet rule, during the campaign against religion, the government attempted to popularize cremation. The first Soviet crematorium was built in Petrograd in 1920. There's even a preserved document recording the first cremation. The honor went to the body of a 19-year-old Red Army soldier named Malishev. Soviet newspapers actively promoted cremation as a fashionable and progressive method of burial. At that time, many famous people were cremated, including Vladimir Mayakovsky and Maxim Gorky. Yet cremation remains far less common than burial in Russia. Today, 31 official crematoria operate in the country. I stress official for a reason. Anything can happen in the funeral business. For example, last year, underground cremation facilities were found in the Leningrad region and in Kurgan. It turns out that in Russia, there is one crematorium for every 5 million people. Let's compare this with other countries. In the US, there is one crematorium for every 159,000 people. In Japan, one for every 79,000. Nevertheless, in the past, the 36 Russian crematoria were sufficient to meet demand in this enormous country.
Alexei Suloyev, president of the Russian Crematorium Association. This public organization advocates the adoption of a state program for building crematoriums across the country. The association provides legal and informational support to entrepreneurs who want to build crematoriums.
The market potential is 10 times larger. If we follow European standards, Russia needs about 300 more crematoriums. And if we follow American standards, then roughly 900 need to be built.
When COVID-19 arrived in Russia, Federal Service for the Oversight of Consumer Protection in some regions recommended cremating the bodies of infected people rather than burying them. Overall, according to the Russian Union of Funeral Organizations, demand for cremation grew by an average of 15%, but many regions simply do not have crematoriums.
The pandemic clearly demonstrated the strong demand for this service. Plus, people have less money now, and cremation is twice as cheap as a traditional burial in the ground. That's why we're seeing such a surge in construction and demand for cremation services today.
According to the Crematorium Association, 19 of the 31 crematoriums in Russia are private. In Magnitogorsk, authorities even tried to shut one down, claiming that private crematoriums supposedly cannot be built. The problem is that the law does not regulate this issue at all. The Magnitogorsk crematorium eventually won its case in court, but the issue remains unresolved. Let's look at the law on funeral services. Article 24 cremation contains just 2 points. The first states that crematoriums may be built for burial purposes and may be under the jurisdiction of local governments. The second states that municipalities determine how they operate, and that's essentially it.
This phrase, "may be under," is interpreted by lawyers however they want, meaning do it this way if you wish, do it that way if you prefer. That's why those crematoriums that first opened in the 1990s and later had to go through 20, 15 or 12 court cases to prove that they had the right to exist and operate.
So in theory, private operators can open such facilities. The main thing is to find a suitable location. The placement of crematoriums, like any other buildings, is governed by sanitary and construction regulations. Under sanitary and epidemiological rules, the buffer zone around a crematorium must be 500 meters for one furnace and 1,000 meters if there are multiple furnaces. Urban planning rules require a minimum distance of 300 meters between a crematorium and residential buildings, schools, hospitals, and recreational areas. But even when all regulations are met, local residents may still oppose the construction.
The furnaces we use today have 0 sanitary protection zones everywhere else in the world. But under our legislation, they require a 1-kilometer sanitary protection zone.
A new law on funeral services is currently being reviewed in the State Duma and, in theory, should bring order to the industry. At the very least, the new rules should eliminate black market agents and chaotic pricing. Funeral professionals themselves believe that real order will come only when the funeral industry is allowed to become a real business.
If you had to summarize what's wrong with the funeral industry in Russia, the answer can be given in one word: everything. Everything is wrong. In Russia, it is not perceived as a business at all. It's not a funeral business. It's ritual services. Listen, there is no such concept as ritual services in any other country. Rituals, for God's sake. Rituals are a type of activity that has nothing to do with business.
It needs to become, this sounds terrible, but something like McDonald's. You know exactly what your options are. You have completely standardized services that cost standard prices. You choose what you need, and then normal marketing rules apply. And you think, well, maybe it really is a good idea to have someone cry at the funeral. And you're ready to pay for that. But right now, when you're in grief, they just rush to take advantage of you. And the result is what it is.
The task of the funeral industry is very simple: to ensure the deceased receives a dignified farewell and not interfere with the grieving family. Unfortunately, right now, funeral companies often just profit off people's grief and turn their lives into a nightmare. And the state is in no hurry to restore order, allowing black agents and semi-criminal firms to do whatever they want. It is unlikely that anything will change until uniform standards are adopted nationwide, until police officers and medical staff are punished for leaking information, until deputies and officials stop holding shares in funeral companies, until all the cemeteries in the country are counted. And this is only part of the problem. If you dig deeper, you may be even more horrified.